Peter Thiel, the Silicon Valley investor who helped create PayPal, called for universities like Harvard and Stanford and others to lose their nonprofit status during a speech at the National Conservatism Conference in Washington, D.C. Sunday, where I was in attendance. Thiel, a Stanford graduate, says that since the schools are inherently political institutions, their nonprofit tax-exempt status should be revoked. And in an era where student debt is exploding to unheard-of levels, maybe Thiel has a point. Today, borrowers in the student loan system owe more than $1.5 trillion with an average of $34,000 of debt per person. American taxpayers stand to lose more than $31 billion on the program in the next decade. And meanwhile, schools like Harvard and Yale can continue to reap the tax-free benefit status of their nonprofit while churning out graduates that work in jobs that not only don't utilize their degrees, don't require a college diploma in the first place, all while acting like political institutions that are indoctrinating our elites in this country.
All right, so I have some questions.
Yes.
Because you were there, I wasn't. So did he just single out Ivy League schools, or are we talking about...
The point was that what makes Harvard and Stanford is good is just like a Studio 54 type thing in New York, where because there's a long line, that means the club has to be good.
Right.
That doesn't mean that the club is actually good in the first place.
Agree.
And that because of this line waiting system, we've constructed this alternative reality where these institutions like Harvard, who have a larger endowment than the GDP of small African nations, are allowed to keep this nonprofit status, all while acting as inherently political actors and while we have a student debt bubble, which is ridiculous. And I've actually looked at some of the data on this. If you took 99% of the college endowments in this country, right now, you could wipe out student loan debt.
Fine.
Yeah.
And I'm no Ivy League defender, quite to the contrary. However, if we're going to talk about inherently political organizations losing nonprofit status, you have to look at some churches today.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point.
Completely inserted themselves in a shameless way into politics.
I think that's a totally fair
in the era
point.
of
If
Trump.
you're going to have candidates and all this other stuff, then these are political institutions. And talking about it's if you want to keep nonprofit, then there have to be certain ways that you keep that status. I understand why people are iffy about talking about it, but I am completely fine with redefining many of these issues because I think that the entire nonprofit structure is a mockery of what it was supposed to be.
Fair. Agree. China's economy is growing at its slowest pace since 1992, when Beijing began publishing official records of quarterly growth. According to the Wall Street Journal, ongoing trade tensions with the U.S., coupled with weak quarterly investments, are playing a major factor in that muted growth. 2019's second quarter was highlighted by multiple developments in the trade war, including the ramping up of tensions between the U.S. and the Chinese tech firm Huawei, and the Trump administration raising tariffs on Chinese products. Of course, President Trump took a little victory lap on Twitter this morning. He tweeted, "China's second quarter growth is the slowest it has been in more than 27 years. The U.S. tariffs are having a major effect on companies wanting to leave China for non-tariffed countries. Thousands of companies are leaving. This is why China wants to make a deal." The Chinese government had hoped to stimulate its economy with nearly $300 billion in tax cuts. However, it seems that move has not had the impact Beijing hoped for. It's all very interesting. We also saw Huawei announcing big layoffs in the U.S. due to Trump administration's posture towards them. One thing I would say, though, just in terms of thinking about this, it's always important to remember that China has a strong hand to play here because they don't have to deal with democracy in the same way.
They do, but they also have an economy extremely vulnerable to U.S. tariffs. And if you go watch CNBC, they have a meltdown every time there's a tariff, and that's because it's bad for Goldman Sachs. But the truth is, a tariff is not a unilateral tax on Americans. If you go watch cable news all day, every day, it's like, oh, tariffs, you're taxing American consumers. No. Part of the burden is going to be felt by Americans.
Yeah.
The real question is who's going to hurt more? Do you know how much of a big deal it is to the domestic Chinese political situation to have the slowest growth in 27 years? That is a death blow to President Xi Jinping. His entire strategy, made in 2025, One Belt, One Road, is all predicated on this big personality who can lead China away from the West. And to be hit with such a public blow like this, huge credit undermining for him.
Death blow is probably going a little far.
Sure.
And I would say at this point, look, they have been able to, keep going, walking away from the table, coming back. We have not seen any real concessions, one from the Chinese yet. And I think at this point, they feel like they could just wait them out.
They can try. In the meantime, they'll continue to suffer.
Tomorrow on Rising, One organization is recruiting churches to act as sanctuaries for immigrants and for their families. We're going to tell you about that. And the National Domestic Workers Alliance is working alongside some high-profile lawmakers to introduce a first-of-its-kind bill.
And we're going to talk to one of the authors of an explosive new book about the plot to derail Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation. Team Rising is going to be here.